August 29, 1945, a humid dawn over San Fernando, Pampanga, 2 weeks after Tokyo's radio had told an empire to lay down its arms. The sky was the slate of coming rain, heat rose in bands off the dirt road, and the air smelled of wet earth, burned straw, and the thin smoke of kitchen fires. Crickets shrieked with the same relentless rhythm they had kept through the occupation. A distant motor trundled along a ruined highway, and the bamboo stockade of a makeshift detention site sighed as men and women shifted within. Behind that fence, a handful of Japanese nurses stood shoulder to shoulder, their white uniforms now grey and frayed, hair pinned tight not in defiance, but to keep it out of their faces. Their mouths were dry from rationed tea. Their hands remembered surgical precision even when trembling. From the farmer's vantage, the moment was ordinary, neighbours bringing the day's harvest to market. But for those on the inside, it felt like an impossible breach of wartime logic. Baskets of sweet potatoes, taro, and bunches of bananas were extended through the slats, a simple, agricultural economy of giving. The guards, American soldiers whose helmets still bore the mud of campaigns from Leyte and Luzon, stood with their rifles angled downward. No order came to stop the exchange. For the captured women, the gesture collided with the imperial code they had been taught to worship, an ethic that equated capture with disgrace and expected maltreatment at the hands of victors as a corrective humiliation. Trained to expect hatred, they found instead smiles and the soft, practiced courtesy of subsistence farmers. Some of the older Japanese women later described that instant as seismic, not because it altered the geopolitics of occupation, but because it ruptured a moral certainty. It suggested that survival might be negotiated by kindness rather than by force. American field reports of the period record dozens of such informal interactions across Luzon and the Visayas, small acts that were not formal policy, but that influenced how occupation unfolded in villages and camps. The vegetables were food, yes, but they were also an unplanned curriculum in mercy. They taught prisoners in a single morning that defeat did not have to be total humiliation. That lesson would echo in later efforts to reframe former combatants as citizens, and it points the story toward the broader programs, books, schooling, and reconstruction, that followed this quiet, revolutionary tenderness. July 1945. Across the Western Pacific, the Japanese Empire was collapsing in slow motion. Supply convoys had vanished beneath Allied torpedoes. Rice and fuel shipments from the home islands no longer reached the front. Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe smoldered nightly under the thunder of B-29 superfortresses, each carrying up to 10 tons of incendiaries that turned whole districts into sheets of fire. In the Philippines, the once proud 14th Area Army was fragmenting. Columns of exhausted soldiers stumbled north toward the mountain towns of Baguio and Bambang, abandoning the sick, the wounded, and the women who had served beside them. Many of those women belonged to the Japanese Army Nurse Corps and the Women's Volunteer Corps, auxiliaries who had tended shattered bodies through years of retreat. Stationed at field hospitals near Manila, Clark Field, and Tarlac, they were trained to heal others but not themselves. When the Americans advanced, surrender was not in their vocabulary. Under Bushido, capture meant moral annihilation. In early 1945, as the U.S. 6th Army and Filipino guerrillas liberated Luzon, thousands of these nurses faced the unthinkable. Some burned their medical records and insignia to erase their military identity. Others swallowed poison or slashed their wrists with surgical scalpels. But death was not always merciful. Many were too weak or too frightened to finish the act. Those who survived the chaos found themselves marched or trucked to temporary enclosures hastily established under American command. Camp O'Donnell, once a site of death for American POWs in 1942, now served as a reception center for the very enemy that had once guarded it. Reports from the 6th Army's medical section noted the condition of the female captives: severe malnutrition, malaria, beriberi, and psychological trauma so deep that many refused to eat, whispering that food from the enemy would defile their souls. Yet the Allied policy toward them was deliberately restrained. General Walter Kruger's headquarters emphasized humane treatment and medical care, an approach meant both to uphold the Geneva spirit and to demonstrate moral contrast to Japan's wartime record. Prison nurses received rations of rice and tinned meat, medical attention from US and Filipino doctors, and even access to reading material confiscated from abandoned schools. For the women, these gestures only deepened the confusion. The empire that had trained them to die with honor had dissolved. Their captors, whom they had been taught to despise, enforced order without cruelty. They lived behind barbed wire, but the brutality they expected never came. As Manila's skyline lay blackened by artillery and flame, the surviving nurses began to grasp a truth they could not yet articulate: that living on, in defiance of death's command, was itself an act of rebellion. Their survival was not permitted by the emperor, but by the humanity of those they had been told were beasts. From that paradox, from the tension between indoctrination and experience, emerged the moral theater in which one quiet, extraordinary encounter would soon unfold. It would happen in San Fernando, where mercy, delivered through a simple gesture of food, would challenge everything they believed about defeat. September 1945. The monsoon rains had returned to Luzon, flattening the dust of war into a paste of mud and ash. Across the island, the crack of hammers replaced the thunder of artillery as American engineers rebuilt bridges and depots. Yet amid that reconstruction, a moral question loomed larger than logistics. What to do with the tens of thousands of surrendered Japanese, soldiers, medics, clerks, and women, now held in hastily fenced compounds under Allied control? For General Walter Kruger's Sixth Army, the answer would define the tone of victory. The directives issued from headquarters at Fort Stotzenberg were unambiguous. All prisoners, regardless of gender or rank, were to receive humane treatment in accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention. The orders were clear, but the emotions surrounding them were not. The memory of Bataan, where thousands of Americans and Filipinos had died in forced marches and jungle camps, was barely 3 years old. For many in the U.S. ranks, compassion toward Japanese captives felt like a betrayal of the fallen. At Clark Field, logistics officers drew up requisitions not for bombs or bullets, but for food, cornmeal, powdered milk, canned meat, salt. The supplies came from U.S. Army quartermaster stockpiles and, in time, from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which was already operating across liberated Asia. Filipino civilians, many of whom bore the scars of occupation, watched the process with silent suspicion. Some had lost entire families to Japanese reprisals. Others still carried machetes for protection when traveling the roads. Yet when asked to assist, many complied. The U.S. command, determined to demonstrate that law had survived war, made the feeding of prisoners a public act of principle. The 501st Quartermaster Regiment, aided by medical and chaplain units, oversaw rations, hygiene, and moral discipline. In a report filed that month, Lieutenant George C. Lewis recorded his impressions of the female detainees at San Fernando. They received food with visible confusion. They bowed, but not in gratitude, more as if unsure of what was expected of them. The women's faces were hollowed by malnutrition. Their eyes darted between the guards and the food tins with a childlike uncertainty. The act of being fed by the enemy violated everything they had been told about captivity. In imperial training manuals, Allied soldiers were caricatured as cruel and immoral. To accept their generosity was to invite spiritual contamination. Yet the Americans insisted on courtesy, medical care, and the dignity of order. The prisoners' instinct for self-erasure, honed through years of propaganda, collided with a new, disorienting reality in which mercy was policy, not weakness. Slowly, the framework of the imperial moral universe began to crack. What the Japanese government had framed as dishonor, the Americans treated as survival. What the women expected to be degradation unfolded instead as discipline tempered by restraint. When rural Filipino volunteers later arrived with baskets of cassava, bananas, and taro, supplementing the army rations with gifts of the land, the shock deepened. These were the same people their propaganda had called savages, yet they offered sustenance without a trace of vengeance. A few of the prisoners wept quietly, unable to understand why they were being forgiven. For the Americans, it was a demonstration of victory's moral purpose. For the Japanese women, it was an unmaking of faith. In that contradiction lay the seed of a revelation that would transform captivity from a sentence into a lesson. What began with food distributions and polite formality would soon culminate in a moment so simple and so shattering that it would redefine the meaning of surrender itself. By October 1945, the guns had fallen silent, but the Philippines remained a landscape of ruin and reckoning. Across Luzon, Allied engineers converted former Japanese garrisons and airfields into makeshift detention centers. Camp O'Donnell, once synonymous with death during the Bataan campaign, now flew the Stars and Stripes. Los Baños and Tarlac followed, along with smaller compounds spread from Pampanga to Nueva Ecija. These sites housed tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners, officers, medics and civilian auxiliaries awaiting repatriation. The American command was determined to draw a line between retribution and justice. Unlike the Japanese-run camps that had dotted occupied Asia, where starvation, disease, and forced labor claimed countless Allied lives, the new Allied facilities enforced a rigid but humane order. The rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention were not theoretical here. They were a deliberate demonstration of civilization's endurance. Daily life in the camps followed a rhythm foreign to both captors and captives. At dawn, bugles called for roll. Work parties maintained sanitation ditches and repaired fences. Medical inspections followed under the supervision of American nurses and Filipino medics. Female prisoners, still in their patched khaki or hospital whites, were segregated into designated compounds overseen by both U.S. Army nurses and local guards. They were issued mosquito nets, soap and work tools, small luxuries compared to the jungle retreats from which they had been captured. The Red Cross, conducting periodic inspections, recorded that the average ration reached nearly 2,800 calories per day. Rice, corned beef, powdered milk, and occasional bread from military bakeries. Spartan, but enough to keep life measurable again. Disease, however, remained the camp's constant enemy. Malaria and dysentery cut through the enclosures like invisible fire. In O'Donnell alone, field records list dozens of deaths weekly, mostly the frail and the elderly. Graves were marked with wooden stakes, their inscriptions fading in the tropical rain. Yet even in that grim environment, traces of humanity began to surface. Filipino camp workers, many widowed or orphaned by the occupation, began offering food from their own harvests. They came not with ceremony but with quiet persistence. Baskets of bananas, cassava, leafy greens, and camote passed discreetly through wire gaps or handed to American guards for distribution. These gestures defied the expected cycle of revenge. They reflected an older agrarian ethic, the belief that to share food was to restore balance after suffering. For the Japanese women behind the fences, the effect was devastating in its gentleness. Camp diaries later recovered from Los Baños tell of prisoners who wept as they peeled root vegetables for communal meals, unable to reconcile the sight of former victims showing compassion. One wrote, "We had been told that defeat meant annihilation, yet these people give us their food. For many, it was their first confrontation with the moral inversion of defeat, the discovery that mercy could wield more authority than conquest." Even the Americans noticed the transformation. Guards who had once refused eye contact with the captives now greeted them with nods. Camp administrators recorded fewer suicide attempts and a steady improvement in morale. By mid-1946, the war crimes tribunals in Manila were underway, and the first transports were preparing to return Japanese nationals home. But within the barbed wire, another kind of justice had already begun, one rooted not in punishment, but in the shared recognition of survival. The camps of Luzon, with their hybrid of discipline and compassion, became paradoxical sanctuaries, places where humiliation was slowly reinterpreted as awakening. Every exchanged vegetable, every quiet meal beneath the palm trees, carried within it the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. Those moments would linger in memory long after the last prisoners boarded their ships, reminders that even amid ruins, humanity could take root again, literally, through the food that passed over fences. By early 1946, the battlefields of central Luzon had begun to green again. What had once been cratered farmland was slowly reclaimed by the very people who had survived its devastation. With aid from the US-backed Philippine Rehabilitation Administration, local cooperatives received new seed stock, hand tools, and fertilizer. The program's intent was pragmatic: revive subsistence agriculture, restore local trade, and ease dependence on US military supply lines. But its consequences reached far beyond economics. In the provinces of Pampanga and Tarlac, villagers planted what grew fastest: sweet potatoes, camote, mung beans, and upland rice. These hardy crops could mature in weeks and endure the rains. By the year's first harvest, the countryside shimmered again with life. Yet what happened next defied the logic of both politics and vengeance. Instead of selling their entire yield in town markets, many farmers began carrying portions to the nearby POW enclosures that dotted the plains. There were no orders, no quotas, no ceremonies. The donations began as individual choices: an old man leaving a bundle of cassava by a gate, a mother passing bananas to an American sentry who would deliver them inside. Oral histories collected decades later recall the same refrain: we had enough to forgive. After years of famine, forced labor, and executions, these gestures emerged not from surplus, but from fatigue. Mercy was the only strength left to those who had suffered too much to hate. The Japanese prisoners, especially the women of the former Army Nurse Corps, could not comprehend it. Their world had taught that surrender stripped one of humanity. Defeat, according to imperial code, made them beneath compassion, objects of shame rather than beings worthy of care. So when Filipino farmers arrived at the wire, smiling and extending food, the prisoners hesitated. They bowed stiffly, trembling, expecting mockery or deceit. Instead, they were met with quiet kindness, warm fruit, gentle words, and no demand for apology. Many later described the moment as disorienting, almost unbearable, to be forgiven without deserving it. American officers observed the exchanges with cautious approval. Reports from the 6th Army's Civil Affairs Division noted that prisoner morale improved wherever civilian generosity was tolerated. What began as a few scattered deliveries soon became a rhythm woven into camp life. Twice each week, local farmers brought small offerings: bananas, taro, baskets of greens, and passed them through the wire. The Americans did not intervene. They understood the symbolic power of the ritual. Each offering chipped away at the psychological armor of both sides, dissolving the distinction between captor and captive. Within months, a strange equilibrium took hold. The fields that had once sustained the occupier now sustained the defeated. The farmers who had once hidden in fear now approached the fences unafraid. In the humid mornings of Pampanga, where the smell of tilled soil mixed with smoke from American cookhouses, the Pacific War's moral ledger began to shift, not through treaties or tribunals, but through simple acts of feeding. The Japanese women, once unable to meet their captors' eyes, began returning gestures with genuine bows. Gratitude replaced disbelief. Out of those quiet exchanges, Asia's long post-war reconciliation began, not in conference halls, but between hands that passed vegetables through W. To understand the magnitude of the prisoners' astonishment, one must return to the foundations of the world that shaped them. For more than a decade before Japan's surrender, the twin ideals of Bushido and Yamato Nadeshiko had governed both men and women of the empire. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that honor transcended life itself. To surrender was to invite eternal shame. Its feminine counterpart, Yamato Nadeshiko, demanded the same self-abnegation from women: purity, obedience, and the willingness to sacrifice for nation and emperor. From 1937 onward, this creed was everywhere, etched into textbooks, woven into wartime cinema, and recited at girls' schools. Publications like Nippon Fujin and Fujokai exalted women who sent their husbands and sons to die, and urged nurses to serve as flowers of death. Mercy was painted as a foreign corruption, compassion toward an enemy, an act of treason. By 1945, an entire generation had been conditioned to believe that capture erased identity. It was against this moral architecture that the events in the Philippine camps struck like an earthquake. When the Japanese women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, received food from American guards or Filipino civilians, they were not merely accepting nourishment. They were confronting the collapse of their moral cosmos. Allied psychologists attached to the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division began noting peculiar reactions among the female POWs, tremors, crying fits, or sudden laughter when treated kindly. In one report, an officer described it as disorientation bordering on hysteria. The kindness itself was unbearable precisely because it contradicted every truth they had been taught. A nurse captured near Clark Field later told interrogators, "The world became inverted. The enemy acts as friend, and we are those who wronged." Such confessions revealed a deeper battlefield than the one fought with bullets. The collapse of Bushido was not achieved through bombing raids or battlefield defeat, but through exposure to an incompatible morality, one that placed dignity above vengeance. The women found themselves stripped not only of weapons, but of certainties. The simple act of being shown respect by their captors forced a reckoning that even Japan's surrender had not produced. For Allied officers monitoring prisoner behavior, the change was unmistakable. Reports from late 1945 and early 1946 observed that female detainees who experienced acts of kindness became markedly more cooperative. They followed orders not out of submission, but out of confused gratitude. What American and Filipino administrators saw as basic decency, fair rations, medical attention, civility, functioned unintentionally as psychological warfare of the most humane kind. The women's ideological scaffolding, built upon years of militarized virtue, disintegrated under the weight of contradiction. In the end, the defeat of Bushido among these women was not a conquest of arms but of conscience. The very qualities their training had dismissed, mercy, empathy, restraint, proved to be the forces that dismantled their indoctrination. Where imperial doctrine had demanded death to preserve honor, the Allies demonstrated that honor could survive compassion. For the Japanese women behind the wire, this realization was both liberation and torment, a slow, painful awakening to the possibility that the virtues they had scorned were, in truth, the ones that endured. Though born of compassion, these gestures did not exist in isolation. By 1946, they had become intertwined with a broader design of Allied policy. From Tokyo to Manila, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, viewed moral rehabilitation as the cornerstone of post-war reconstruction. The war, in his view, had not been won merely by destroying armies, but by dismantling the ideology that produced them. In this, food became as potent a weapon as firebombs. Directives issued from Manila's Civil Affairs Division instructed camp commanders across the Philippines to demonstrate the contrast between democratic and militarist principles through conduct. The order's language was bureaucratic, but its intent was revolutionary. Mercy itself would become propaganda. Feeding Japanese POWs, even amid ration shortages that strained Allied and civilian supplies alike, was no accident of generosity. It was policy. American field officers, such as Major Howard Smith of the 6th, Army's Military Government Section, noted in his March 1946 report that discipline improved where fairness was. Practiced, this was not sentimentality, it was strategy. The U.S. command understood that behavior could preach louder than leaflets. Fairness, when witnessed, became its own form of indoctrination. And so, in camp after camp, the Allies enforced civility as a psychological weapon, designed to erode the myths of cruelty that Japanese militarism had built around the Western enemy. Filipino participation amplified this quiet campaign. Civil affairs officers encouraged local farmers and relief workers to assist in food distribution, framing it as both economic and moral rehabilitation. Villagers who arrived at the fences with baskets of cassava or taro may not have known they were part of a larger strategy, yet their acts of kindness became instruments of policy. The U.S. Army Signal Corps documented these moments with deliberate care. Photographs of smiling civilians handing food to Japanese women through barbed wire were later used in re-education pamphlets circulated in occupied Japan. Beneath the images, the captions were succinct and pointed: "Democracy nourishes, militarism starves." For the Americans, it was a calculated contrast between two moral orders. For the Japanese prisoners, it was a contradiction made flesh. The same hand that had once wielded a rifle now offered sustenance. Many of the women struggled to interpret the gestures. Were they mercy, humiliation, or something else entirely? Allied psychologists observed that this uncertainty produced what they termed adaptive acceptance, a gradual, almost subconscious internalization of the new moral order. To the captives, power was being redefined, not as domination but as restraint. Yet among the Filipino civilians, policy and compassion were indistinguishable. Their generosity required no orders. They remembered starvation too vividly to deny food to anyone, even those who had once worn the enemy's flag. What SCAP conceived as moral engineering was, on the ground, simply the human instinct to rebuild. The irony was that this unscripted sincerity gave the policy its greatest strength. In the months that followed, Japanese women in the camps began to mimic the behaviors they witnessed, thanking guards, sharing rations, volunteering for camp work. Their transformation was not born from lectures or written declarations, but from observation. The re-education that MacArthur envisioned was taking root not in classrooms but in daily life. In time, this lived example of democracy, discipline softened by decency, would seep back into the Japanese consciousness more deeply than any constitution imposed by occupation authorities. It was a revolution not of... In the months following Japan's surrender, Allied intelligence officers sought not only to disarm an army, but to measure the collapse of an ideology. Between 1946 and 1947, they began systematically collecting diaries, letters, and personal notes from Japanese female prisoners held in the Philippines. The task fell to analysts from the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division and the Civil Affairs section in Manila, who viewed private writings as a mirror of national morale. From these pages, often scribbled in fading ink on scrap paper or the backs of ration forms, they pieced together a collective portrait of astonishment, shame, and transformation. What emerged was not the bitterness of the defeated, but the bewilderment of those confronting a moral universe turned inside out. One diary, written by a young nurse named Keiko Nishida, captured the essence of that disorientation. Held at Camp O'Donnell, she described a morning when a Filipino farmer handed her cassava through the fence. "He fed me, though I had starved his children. I wanted to vanish." The entry, brief and restrained, revealed a psychological collapse deeper than physical captivity, the agony of being shown compassion by someone she had been taught to despise. Another woman, Lieutenant Yuko Takada, recorded with equal disbelief, "The guards salute us. My emperor never prepared me for this." The paradox was unbearable. They had expected to die in disgrace. Instead, they were being treated as human beings. For Allied translators reviewing these writings, the language itself became a revelation. Words once forbidden under state Shinto, forgiveness, atonement, rebirth, began to appear again and again, as though moral vocabulary was reawakening after a long exile. The women wrote not of revenge or humiliation, but of confusion and reflection. Many wrestled with guilt, not only for their nation's crimes, but for their own participation in a system that had taught cruelty as virtue. American psychologists noted a pattern. Female POWs exposed to consistent humane treatment displayed higher levels of adaptability and remorse upon repatriation. Their diaries suggested that kindness, repeated daily, had accomplished what interrogation could not. It dissolved the ideological armor forged by a decade of militarist indoctrination. By the time the repatriation process began in late 1946, these women spoke of their captors with something close to reverence. In hearings before Allied boards, several expressed gratitude toward Filipino civilians who had shared food despite their own deprivation. "They made us see ourselves," one nurse testified. "It was not America that defeated Japan, but mercy." For investigators accustomed to measuring victory in numbers, divisions surrendered, tons of weapons seized, these testimonies pointed to another, quieter triumph, the moral disarmament of the defeated. In the years that followed, historians would mine these fragile documents to reconstruct the emotional front line of Japan's post-war awakening. Each diary stood as evidence that the war's most enduring conquest was internal, the overthrow of hatred by the simple act of being forgiven. For the women of Camp O'Donnell, Los Baños, and Tarlac, their written confessions became more than records of captivity. They were declarations of rebirth, the first hesitant voices in a chorus that would help redefine Japan's conscience in the decades to come. By 1947, The chapter of captivity in the Philippines was drawing to a close. The majority of surviving Japanese POWs had been repatriated aboard transport vessels such as the USS General Hodges and USS Gosper. Female internees, carrying small bundles of clothing and the occasional food gift from Filipino civilians, boarded quietly at Manila Harbor. The harbor itself seemed to echo with the weight of history. The jagged silhouette of Corregidor loomed in the distance, still scarred from artillery and bombing campaigns. As the ships pulled away, many women wept, not only for the physical and emotional toll of years in captivity, but also for the unexpected grace that had punctuated their ordeal. The mixture of shame and gratitude was palpable, and American chaplains aboard offered voluntary services, allowing passengers to speak or simply reflect in silence. U.S. Repatriation Bureau reports described the scene in understated terms. Quiet passengers, polite, introspective, deeply affected. The journey home was more than a physical return. It was a psychological passage from one moral universe to another. When the ships reached Japanese ports, the internees found a homeland flattened by firebombing, yet a society poised for reinvention. Occupation authorities, recognizing the profound impact of their experiences, often placed these women in informal roles as educators and community facilitators in reconstruction programs. Their first-hand lessons in empathy, stories of Filipino farmers who shared food, of American soldiers who treated them with dignity, became tools to reshape post-war civic consciousness. In private diaries and public speeches, they recounted acts of mercy that had seemed impossible, using them to replace decades of militarist indoctrination with a new ethic of compassion. Many returned to their pre-war professions under entirely transformed circumstances. Nurses who had once tended soldiers in battlefields now joined post-war relief efforts under the Japanese Red Cross, treating the sick and displaced with a renewed sense of purpose. Service became for some a form of penance, an acknowledgement that their survival had depended not on the sword, but on the simple acts of kindness extended by former enemies. In conversations with younger generations, they emphasized that true strength lay in restraint, mercy, and moral courage, not in blind obedience or militaristic pride. The voyage home, therefore, completed a subtle but profound circle. Women who had been trained to serve an empire at the point of the bayonet became witnesses and transmitters of humanity, carrying with them a proof that moral awakening could survive even amid physical defeat. Their stories later reverberated in Japan's peace movements, literature, and civic programs, forming a quiet backbone to post-war conscience. In the end, these journeys across the Pacific demonstrated that the deepest lessons of the war were not found in treaties or textbooks, but in the lived experience of mercy, the realization that even in defeat, the capacity to learn, to forgive, and to embody compassion remained Japan's truest form of survival. For the Filipino civilians who witnessed and facilitated these acts, mercy was never an exercise in forgetfulness. It was a deliberate assertion of moral sovereignty. Between 1942 and 1945, families across Pampanga, Bulacan, and Nueva Ecija had endured the full weight of Japanese occupation, forced labor on rice paddies, summary executions in village squares, and famine that stripped both body and spirit. Liberation offered the opportunity for vengeance, yet community leaders quickly recognized that repeating cruelty would only perpetuate the cycle they had survived. Instead, they framed forgiveness as the highest form of victory, their moral reclamation stronger than any military triumph. Church groups, peasant cooperatives, and organizations such as the Federation of Free Farmers organized programs to share food with nearby Allied-run POW camps. Fresh fruits, root vegetables, and leafy greens passed quietly over barbed wire, moving from the hands of those who had suffered most to those who had once been their oppressors. These acts were grounded in centuries-old Catholic principles of charity and reinforced by indigenous, Filipino traditions of bayanihan, communal solidarity, in which communities bore collective burdens and shared resources for survival. To outsiders, the peasants' generosity was astonishing. American officers noted in reports that villagers who had lost sons, daughters, or spouses to the occupation still offered sustenance with calm resolve, refusing acknowledgement or reward. In feeding the former enemy, Filipinos reclaimed authority over their own moral universe. They demonstrated that true power did not reside solely in the barrel of a gun or the mandate of an occupying army, but in the ability to choose compassion in the face of past trauma. By treating prisoners as human rather than monster, they subverted the binary logic of wartime propaganda. American observers, used to imagining colonized populations as passive, recorded a quiet astonishment. Those who had been conquered could exert moral strength equal to and sometimes greater than the victorious. This ethical inversion, the conquered teaching forgiveness to liberators, remains one of the most profound yet least recorded reversals of the Pacific War. It left an enduring imprint not only on the women behind the wire but also on Philippine civic consciousness. The lessons of mercy and moral autonomy, practiced in the fields and villages around Luzon, shaped post-war diplomacy, providing a foundation for the nation's continuing advocacy for humanitarian principles across Asia. In these acts of generosity, the Philippines claimed a quiet, resilient authority that true victory is measured not by the defeat of an enemy, but by the courage to extend humanity in the aftermath of suffering. By the early 1950s, the formal reconciliation between Japan and the Philippines, codified under the Treaty of Peace and Amity in 1956, reflected decades of diplomatic negotiation, yet its moral foundation had been laid long before in the camps of Luzon. Historians now recognize the vegetable exchanges not merely as curious anecdotes, but as seminal examples of post-conflict reconciliation in practice. In the immediate post-war years, Allied educational initiatives seized upon these moments as teaching tools. Films such as Seeds of Freedom, 1949, dramatized the interactions between Filipino farmers and Japanese female POWs, illustrating how democratic principles could manifest through everyday acts of generosity and order. Newspapers in Japan revisited the testimonies of returning nurses, portraying them as narratives of spiritual rebirth rather than defeat. The images of smiling civilians and hesitant captives challenged the older wartime script, reframing surrender as a moral, not just military, condition. Sociologists and policymakers studying post-conflict rehabilitation took notice as well. Reports circulated by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration in the early 1950s cited the Luzon camps as evidence that civilian compassion could accelerate de-radicalization. Where indoctrination had hardened attitudes toward mercy as weakness, lived experience softened them. For the women themselves, the lessons were indelible. In interviews conducted decades later, they recalled the scent of tilled soil, the texture of cassava, the quiet rhythm of work and shared meals, far more vividly than the noise of artillery or the heat of combat. Faces of farmers, American guards, and fellow prisoners lingered in memory. Ideology faded into the background. The fence became more than a barrier, it became a symbol. Each vegetable passed over its wires represented a crossing of moral and cultural boundaries, a silent contract between survivors and helpers that transcended nationhood. In that act of giving and receiving, the war's strict hierarchies dissolved. Conqueror and conquered, victor and vanquished, teacher and pupil, all were remade in the small, intimate space of shared humanity. By the time repatriation and reconstruction were complete, the memory of those exchanges had already become a quiet metaphor for Asia's fragile post-war peace. In the decades that followed, the story of the Luzon camps endured not because of treaties or proclamations, but because it demonstrated a universal truth, that history's most profound revolutions often begin not with armies or speeches, but with acts of grace. The legacy of those vegetable fences, where kindness overcame indoctrination and mercy reshaped morality, proved that even in the aftermath of imperial collapse, the human capacity to forgive, nurture, and rebuild could outlast both occupation and empire. In this way, the humble gestures of farmers and prisoners left an imprint on the moral imagination of nations, reminding later generations that reconciliation is forged in the quiet, deliberate choices of ordinary people. 30 years after the guns fell silent, in 1975, the survivors of the Japanese Army Nurse Corps returned to the Philippines for a joint memorial service at Clark Air Base. Among them was Keiko Nishida, the young nurse who decades earlier had wept over cassava offered by a Filipino farmer. Now older, her hands steady, she carried a small basket of sweet potatoes to the same gate where that first act of mercy had crossed the barbed wire. The villagers who had once stood on the other side, faces lined with age and hardship, greeted her warmly, no longer as a former enemy, but as a fellow witness to history. Together, they recited prayers for the dead, honoring both nations' losses, bridging the chasm of memory with solemn recognition. The ritual carried the weight of an entire moral cycle. Hunger, fear, and indoctrination had once dominated that space. Now humility, gratitude, and reconciliation reigned. What had begun as a simple offering of food had evolved into a monument of forgiveness, an emblem of human endurance more lasting than flags, treaties, or empires. For the women who once trembled behind the wire, the memory of compassion had endured far longer than ideology or rank. It had reshaped their understanding of honor, survival, and duty. For the Filipino farmers, the encounter confirmed a quiet truth that had guided them decades earlier. True victory is measured not in conquest or vengeance, but in conscience and moral courage. The war that had consumed much of Asia, leaving cities in ashes and societies scarred, had found its purest conclusion not in tribunals or treaties, but in an exchange of sustenance, the smallest, most intimate form of peace. Beneath the Philippine sun, the old barbed wire fence no longer stood, yet the harvest of mercy remained, etched into memory, symbolizing that even amidst the greatest horrors, humanity could endure, be restored, and flourish.